Today's story is Winter Kingdom Part 6, Ellen, by Aakash Sharma. The phone rang again. I pushed myself out of the couch and onto my feet, ending a dreamless sleep. The phone wasn't next to me as it usually was. I hated being woken up like this, especially with the fatigue I had been experiencing. The room was dark. Even the TV, which I had fallen asleep to, had been turned off. The only source of light that was in here came right through the window from the street lamps. The ringing stopped abruptly. Jim stood next to the window near the door, his left hand pressed against the glass, and his right held the phone to his ear. "Jim?" I asked him, but he raised his hand up, gesturing me to be quiet. I complied, watching him silently. He put the phone up to his ear, and I heard a little voice coming from the other end. In the stillness, with the voice crackling distantly from the phone, I started to feel the prick of unease. Jim looked nervous, almost scared. His face was lined with sweat and his breathing was heavy. Something was very wrong. A bright light came through the window, lighting the whole room behind us, along with the rumbling of a car. The crackling from the phone was abruptly cut off, and Jim dropped it on the floor and stomped on it, completely destroying the thing. I gasped in shock, and he turned to meet my eyes as my lips turned to yell at him. He went out of the room and into the kitchen without saying a word, and I followed. Jim pocketed something. I didn't get the chance to see what it was. He curled and uncurled his fists. I still wasn't used to the sight of his left-handed fist, which was missing a thumb. Even after all this while, it felt uncanny. "Whose car is outside?" I asked him. "What the fuck is going on?" Despite my angry exterior, he knew that I was scared. He placed a hand on my shoulder. "It's all right. We will be all right, but we have to leave right now." "Are you in trouble?" I asked him, to which he gave no reply. I had met Jim not long after leaving home. I stayed with my friend Stacy for a while, who had her own place. I did some chores around, well, technically all the chores around the house, so I wouldn't be a burden until I got my own place. I expected to be bombarded with calls from my dad while I was there, but they never came. It wasn't easy leaving home. It was scary at first, but I'd had enough of living with a bittering man who always carried grimness with him. I had to leave my dog behind as well, and to be honest, I didn't care much for it. My dad had gotten the dog, and I figured that he would want to keep it. But with his visit, I found out that he had given it away a while after my leaving, or at least that's what he told me. The doorbell rang and I jumped. Jim held his breath. For an aspiring actor, his face seemed to be made of stone at times. He slowly made his way out of the kitchen. The bell rang again. He raised his hand again. "Stay put," he seemed to say. I planned to comply this time. I heard a slow shuffling outside, and then I heard the window open. I tried to stay as quiet as possible. I placed a hand on my belly, another on my mouth. I wasn't sure what I was to feel, but I was scared. I was scared for my life and the life of my child. I was almost on the verge of tears, brought on by the confusion, the feeling of not knowing what to anticipate next. I slowly pulled open a drawer and reached for the steak knife, but found nothing. Instead, I pulled out the only other knife in this place, hoping that it would be sufficient enough to defend the two of us from whatever was coming. The thought of Jim outside, and once again not knowing what was coming or what he was doing out there, made me want to tear up. Fighting to hold it back, I tightened my grip on the kitchen blade. There was some more shuffling, and then there was a knock on the door, and I jumped. "Hey," Jim yelled out from the other side, calling on me to unlock the door. I made my way hurriedly to the door, ready to open the door and fall into his arms, to cry and yell, to slap him or hurt him, not knowing what part he played in all this. I was terrified, but also angry. I always knew that this life I married into was too good to be true. It all happened too fast. But why did everything have to go wrong now? I just needed a little longer, just a bit longer. The room was still lit by the light of what I presumed was a car outside. I was almost tempted to see through it, but I was afraid of seeing something awful. The room was also much colder. The window opposite the door was wide open, and the cold air had made its way in. I still held on to the blade, all the while harboring disturbing thoughts as I put my hands on the door. What if it isn't Jim? What if there's someone or something else out there? I held my breath and pulled it open, preparing myself to do whatever I had to do. Jim was covered in blood. 2 corpses lay at his feet. Their faces were so horrible, skinned and all bloody. I almost passed out at the sight of them. I quickly averted my gaze from them, leaving the after-image of a red blur in my vision. Jim was crouched next to them, pulling guns out of their pockets, wiping them clean of the blood. I bent down to throw up, but he came to my side, trying to hold me. I pushed him away, frightened at whatever this was. I'll explain later, but we have to leave now. We don't have much time, he said, as he held me in a forced embrace. They were going to hurt you. I had to... Breathe. It's okay. Just come. He held my hand, and I tried to pull it away, but he took me into the house, where he hurriedly went through his clothes to get a fresh pair that wasn't covered in blood all over. I still hadn't fully accepted what I had seen. The only thing I sensed was danger, and I honestly couldn't tell if I felt it from him. He pulled down a fresh white shirt, and then, apparently sensing how I felt, he came close to me and held me once again. I gasped and almost pushed him away, but he knew how to calm me. He rubbed my back and began to recite his comforting words in my ear. Images from the past came back to me as I felt his warmth. The funeral with my mother, the sight of her lifeless, graying skin that looked nothing that resembled a human being, that had plagued me with nightmares for a long time. And now, looking at this, the 2 butchered corpses, it was almost like something crawled right out of those horrible dreams. Something that held on to me and came along into the waking world. We left the house, and I looked up at the sky. The moon was under a layer of clouds, its light hidden from the world, leaving us in the dark. Jim fished out keys from one of the bodies as I stood next to the car, averting my eyes from that horrible sight. We didn't have a car, and after all that I had witnessed, stealing a car was the least of my concerns. I was consumed by fear and paranoia as I awaited the answers from Jim. He was quiet, his face still stern as he hid the guns and the blade under the seat, and then pulled the car out of the driveway. I tucked the kitchen knife that I had to the side of the car, hiding it from Jim. I felt the sudden urge to turn back one last time, to look at the 2 corpses as we went. The more I fought it, the harder it got, and eventually I turned, almost expecting to see them either skinned or alive, or whatever else, anything to make this night worse. They just lay there, still and lifeless. For some reason that almost felt like the oddest possibility out of everything. I took a job as a cashier at a fast food place. My days were empty, and only consisted of going to work and coming back to Stacy's at late hours. Could I have found work closer to where I lived at the time? Possibly. But I didn't want to. For some reason, it felt wrong to stay around old places. Even though Stacy's place was so far away from where my father had lived, I still felt like I wasn't far enough. That bus ride to work and then home was almost soothing, especially when I went farther away. I almost felt like I was leaving something behind. The world where my mother had passed away and then had that awful thing happen at her funeral. The world where my aunt and my brother had gone missing without a trace. I didn't want to be part of that world anymore. Growing up, I never had big dreams or fantasies. All I wanted was a normal life. Or at least something that resembled a normal life. But for some reason, that seemed to be something I could only aspire towards and never really get there. So I began to take solace in a bus, surrounded by other people that I assumed were already living in my fantasy. "We have to get out of town," Jim said, finally breaking the silence. "We may also have to hide for a while. I don't know." "What?" I asked. "Something's wrong with this place," he said. "It's not safe here anymore." "Jim, stop," I said. "Stop. We can't just leave. I don't even know what's going on. What about my dad?" I don't know. I just know that we have to leave," he said. "Sorry. We could have fucking known if you hadn't gone absolute primal on the phone. Whose call was that anyway?" "I couldn't risk anyone tracking us," he said with a serious look on his face. I forced a laugh at the absurdity of what he was saying. Why would... I stopped, and then realized something. "Who's coming after us, Jim?" "Some very, very dangerous people. They're coming after you." "This doesn't make any sense. How do you know this, Jim? How do you know any of this?" "I'll tell you, but just trust me for now." "I have to call my dad," I told him. I feared for his safety now. What if they were the same people who took my brother and my aunt? If they're coming for me, what about my father? "Give me your phone. I have to call him. Please tell me that you still have it." "I don't have it. I had to lose it too." "You lost it?" I asked, feeling 100 different emotions at once. "You fucking lost it?" Jim didn't react to what I said. His eyes were fixed upon the road as we left our neighborhood behind. The 4 fingers of his left hand still held onto the wheel while he placed the other on my shoulder, which I brushed off. "It'll all be okay, I promise. Just don't ask me anything. I need time to think," he said, with a tone of finality, looking at me with sincere eyes. I remember the first time I had seen those eyes. He had taken a seat next to me on the bus, looking exhausted, dressed in a rather old-fashioned coat despite being so young. He didn't say anything at first, and the day had gone by without an interaction. But even after I had gotten off the bus and made my way home, I still couldn't stop thinking about him. There was something about him, about the air that he carried, that I felt strongly attracted to. The next day, I almost didn't expect to see him again. But there he was, still wearing that old-fashioned coat, seated before I even got on the bus back home, and I took my place next to him, resolute to start a conversation this time. He was quiet, and his face was solid like stone, and I felt compelled to stay silent as well. But then my eyes went down to his hands as he pulled them out of his gloves for some reason. He missed a thumb. I immediately asked him about it, feeling embarrassed immediately after. He looked at me with those same sincere eyes and smiled, and I felt all the embarrassment fade away. I felt like this moment was the most natural thing in the world, and he began to go into a story about how he lost it while attempting a particular stunt involving knives. And we talked all the way to his stop. I had gotten so lost in the conversation that I had missed my stop. Now, that excitement was gone. I felt like we had been together for ages. It felt like we were much older than we actually were. We had begun to stitch together what could become some semblance of the life I had always wanted, and now all that began to fall apart. "Nah, fuck me," Jim said, pulling the car over. A man stood ahead of us, holding up his badge. I could hear what sounded like very distant sirens. There were hints of red and blue lights from what looked like all over town, yet here, there was just one lone officer who had decided to pull us over for some reason. For a moment, I almost contemplated getting out of the car and running up to the officer and asking about my dad, and to tell him all that had happened all over at my place. I looked over at Jim, who put on a mask over how he felt and then reached under the seat to where the blade was. I felt the anxiety rising in my stomach. I could tell that he felt the same. "Jim," I tried to whisper to him as the officer approached. "Jim, no." I wasn't exactly sure if he would go through with it, and that was what terrified me. The man I married didn't seem to be a particularly violent person, but this man next to me was both dangerous and unpredictable. "No," I mumbled again as Jim rolled down the window. Jim looked at me and sighed, gritting his teeth, and got back upright. He didn't get the blade or a gun. I was relieved. The man wasn't in uniform, and the car he stood next to didn't seem like a patrol car either. He reached down to the window and said nothing, instead examining the both of us with a thorough look. My eyes were fixed onto my husband's hand. I was still nervous about what he might do next. While I waited in anticipation, my head began to feel lighter and my heart got louder, and in all this, I didn't realize that the man's gaze was fixed on me. "You," he said, and I looked up at him. His eyes squinted in thought, almost as if in recognition. "You're Stan's girl, aren't you? Eleanor, was it? Eleanor Vale?" "Kemper, Ellen Kemper," I said absently. At that moment, I began to think about what Jim had told me. Some very dangerous people, they're coming after you. I looked for the littlest shift in Jim's movement, nervously anticipating that swift movement that will end with the cop dead. And with every moment that flew by, I could sense Jim twitch and ache for the blade under his seat. I looked up to face the policeman, and then something hit me. I knew this man. You were with my dad. Detective Bill?" A smile came over the man's face, a sincere and warm smile. "Haha, you remember your Uncle Billy," he said. Jim seemed less tense now, and I sighed internally. Billy greeted Jim in a friendly way, and Jim nodded back, and then he continued to talk to me. "There's hell going on tonight." His expression turned serious. "Stan, son of a bitch, never talks much. I didn't even know you got married. Where are you kids headed?" I began to answer, but Billy cut me off. "Did you see any suspicious cars? Or maybe some person coming this way?" he asked. Me and Jim shook our heads. "Well, if you do see anything like that ahead, call me, alright? Don't stop for anybody, not even kids. Especially not kids." "What happened?" I asked. Jim looked at me with eyes that told me I shouldn't have asked. "Well, it'll probably be all over the news. It's horrible. You don't want to... There's been some... I don't think you can... Okay, yeah, you're right. We wouldn't want to ruin your night," I said, nodding to Jim, who seemed relieved. "Oh, yeah, that's good. I'm gonna leave you be, but now, remember, don't stop for anyone, and if you see anything suspicious, you call the police. I'd say you best get home tonight, but if you're gonna go out, just listen to whatever I've said, okay? And get home early tonight." I nodded, and Jim thanked him. We were ready to leave, but Billy wasn't done speaking. "Oh, and one last thing. Never mind, I'll talk to your dad. Stay safe." And with that, he left us on our way. Billy went back to lean against his car as we passed him, and eventually, he faded away in the distance. Once again, it was me and Jim. But this time, Jim didn't wait long to break the silence. "Hey, have you ever heard that story? The one about the skinned witch and the king of winter?" The King of Winter was something very familiar to me, but I always imagined that it was something only my mother had known. As he said that, it took me years back to the time when she was alive, but I tried not to think about it because I knew exactly where this chain of thought would lead me. Is it the one with the skeletons? I asked. Skeletons? The throne of skin and blood. And then winter comes? It's been a long time. I thought it was something that my mother came up with to scare us kids. Oh, no. There's more. See. He cleared his throat. There was once a king who lived on a mountain of ice, and... What does that have to do with anything? I said. But I didn't really care as long as what he said made things make sense. I wondered if I would get some answers about my mother and the disappearance of my brother and aunt as well. However, I didn't want to listen to the story, not again. But tonight, and especially now, was different. After the things I had seen, a few terrible moments of the past and the grimness of the real world were something I could bear. They weren't skeletons, Jim said. They were people. Normal people stripped of their skin. They weren't human any longer, not in the traditional sense. They were reduced to being just things. Something to sustain the king. He never just took their skin, he took their agony away. Their pain and fears and all. He promised them he would take it away, and he did, but the thing was... He paused to look at me. Jim, what are you even talking about? He hesitated for a moment. I have to protect you, Elle. You and... He placed a hand on my stomach. This all sounds crazy, but... He studied my face for a second and continued. Never mind. No, tell me. Jim hesitated. There's a certain group of people, fanatics, who believe that they can get the king back, the King of Winter, and they're the ones after you and our child. I didn't say anything for a while, and his words hung in the air. I can't let them have you, Elle. You wanted the truth. That's the truth. They probably have your brother and your aunt also, I guess, but I can't be sure. All I know is that I have to protect you. How do you know this? I just do. But how? How? Dreams. I had dreams. I know what you're thinking, and I know that I wouldn't believe it either, but I've been seeing her in my dreams for so long. I was listening intently, but the more he said, the less things made sense for me. I wanted to tell him to stop. I wanted to get out of the car and away from this crazed man. I felt a warm tear run down my cheek and a sharp pain in my body. This wasn't the man I had fallen in love with. He wasn't in there any longer. But those two people at the house that he had killed, he had told me they had been there to hurt me. And they were armed too, so it couldn't be that far of a lie, right? Maybe there was some truth to what he was saying, or maybe there wasn't. I didn't know what to believe anymore, and I felt a scream rising up in my throat, which remained unreleased. I saw the image of my mother's skin, left like an abandoned cloth in a casket. I heard my brother's words, the things he said about seeing a ghost, in a conversation that was probably the last one I would ever have with him. Would his skin be found somewhere, lying like a discarded suit, too? I remembered Jim's smile, my dad's face when he saw me after all these months, the blue light of the lamp when Jim took me in his arms after the first time we made love, the first time I had been so close to another. And then, the two skinned corpses lying in the snow outside my house. Their faces. Those two at our house. You didn't... Jim sighed and shook his head, and turned away from the road to face me. I turned my eyes away from him, not wanting to meet those eyes of his. Those eyes that were so bloody sincere, yet there was a huge lie hidden in them. They came after you, Ellen. Please, tell me you believe me. I didn't know what to believe anymore. He called my name again, placing a hand on my hand, eyes on the road ahead as we approached a rather dangerous neighborhood. Jim, I said, breathing in and bracing myself to meet him with a sternness of my own. Be honest with me. Was our meeting a coincidence? Why did things go so fast? What is even going on anymore? Was it? Jim sighed in silence, averting his eyes away. He lost his courage. I couldn't hold it in any longer. I felt tears well up in my eyes, but I held back. I wouldn't give in until I'm finished. Did you ever love me? I did. Ellen, you have to believe... Stop the car! You're fucking crazy, I said. I could hear my breathing get heavier as rage overtook my sadness. Ellen, we have to leave the city, the fanatics. We can't stop here. The king and... Fuck your king! Stop the car right now! I yelled at the top of my voice and began to reach for the knife. I wasn't thinking anymore. I wanted to get out of the car. I wanted to breathe. The once comforting presence I was with, now, was something dark. A stranger. Something that I was even uncomfortable to breathe around. Stop the car, Jim. I can't. I have to keep you safe. I picked up my knife. I gritted my teeth. I felt such anger that I felt like I was drowning in it. I never felt such intense feelings before. Betrayal, shock, heartbreak, and anger most of all. Jim slowed the car down. Don't do anything I'd had enough of it. I stabbed at him, never truly intending to hit him and missing completely. The car stopped abruptly, and Jim pulled the keys out, opening the door hastily and stepping out. I left the car too, and began to walk ahead, leaving it behind. Elle, is this what you want? I raised my hand up, raising my middle finger for him to see as I went. I didn't know how this would end. I really didn't. The cold was harsh, but right now, it was the only thing I really wasn't untrusting of. Ellen, he yelled, and I heard hurried footsteps run up behind me. I turned around to face him as he got closer, but I held the knife to my throat. Go away, right now, or I swear to fucking God I'll end myself and your abomination. I felt awful saying all that, but this man had made me feel worse than a few words ever could. I still had doubts. I balanced all the ideas with the storm of my thoughts in my mind. I didn't know what to believe in anymore. Should I believe him, or should I trust myself? He stepped back, and I could read something on his face, but I really didn't want to look at him any longer. Leave me, I said, and kept walking. I don't know where I would go, but with the knife in my hand, he did not follow. And then, I stopped in my tracks. Someone stood ahead of me, or rather something. If it was a person, it shouldn't have been alive. It seemed like a woman. She was naked and her skin seemed to be completely decaying. Her head was grotesquely misshapen and it was almost bald with patches of hair. No one should grow to be this old and still live. Nothing human, at least. She raised her hand and I saw that she lacked a finger, a forefinger. She bent her knees and got down like something feral, and then opened her mouth in a soundless howl. Her mouth had nothing in it. No tongue, no teeth, nothing. It was just pure darkness. It slowly crept closer to me, and all I could do was watch. I was frozen in fear. It stretched its mouth wider and extended its neck towards my womb where my child was. Something snapped at me, and I felt the handle of the knife in my hand. You will not have my child, I heard myself mumble. I slashed at it, and warm blood sprayed onto me as I slashed over and over again. screaming my lungs out until there was nothing but a bloodied mess, and I stood in front of it, dressed in black, and out of the snow, in a rather warm room. My mother's casket lay open, and the bloody mess within lay lifeless, like a discarded suit. I didn't scream. I wasn't afraid. I just stood there staring at it. Time remained still here, and all I could do, or rather think to do, was observe. I heard dripping, and then I watched in horror as water began to rise through the coffin and then started to spill over the casket, creating puddles on the floor, which then turned into streams and circled my feet but never touched them. I woke up, feeling cold on my back as I fell to the ground. So that once again was Winter Kingdom, Part 6, by Aakash Sharma. This is the 6th part of the series, obviously, hence the title, and I hope you all enjoyed it. I've been informed via posts on my subreddit from Mr. Sharma that it does not have 7 parts now, it has 8. So there are 2 left at this point. Didn't expect that, but that's fine by me. Always love getting more, you know. I'm sure it's going to wrap up perfectly, because the story has been amazing in my opinion, so. All that said, if you enjoyed it and would like more like this, please do consider following the channel by subscribing, or, you know, stalking me on any of my social medias and whatnot. Feel free to do it. You don't have to, but if you do, just know that I appreciate it. It's all optional, but, you know, it's good for you. For your health or something. I don't know. Anyway, I hope you all have a beautiful day. I hope you have a great weekend, and I will see you on the next video, but until then, sleep well.